Man, this is kind of sad.
What is?
All this music that's just sitting here. No one's around to listen to it. I don't know. Doesn't seem right.
Storytelling is an artistic discipline that's as old as we are. Today, the most far-reaching stories told are mainly on television and in film, but there's another medium that's often overlooked, which is interactive stories, also known as video games. But what separates this new genre from the stories of old? Well, perhaps what makes games special is they allow the audience to participate in the narrative. They're interactive stories, which is an incredibly new medium that we've only just begun to explore. And while there are many that tell stories in original ways, there's one in particular that utilizes in-game mechanics, not just plot and dialogue, to tell an incredibly emotional story that's had a profound impact on those who've played it. In June of 2013, the video game developer Naughty Dog released The Last of Us, which has since become one of the defining games of this generation. Winning over 240 Game of the Year awards, many have praised its well-developed characters, compelling narrative, beautiful visuals, and wonderfully integrated gameplay. At its heart, The Last of Us is a story about finding humanity in a world that has none. But in order to understand the emotional impact the game has on its players, you need to know the basic premise. In the prologue, the player is introduced to Joel, a single father who is desperately trying to make ends meet as a construction worker so that he can provide for his daughter Sarah, a 12-year-old girl with a mature sense of humor.
Where did you get the money for this?
Drugs. I sell hardcore drugs.
Oh, good. You started helping out with the mortgage then.
Yeah, you wish.
But while things seem normal at first, you quickly notice that something strange is going on.
Dad?
Then suddenly, someone covered in blood barges into the house. Joel has no other choice but to defend Sarah and himself. They then go outside as Tommy, Joel's brother, drives up to the house, and the three of them attempt to leave town. During the drive, they see more carnage and destruction, as well as other evacuees fleeing from the violence. But when they finally get away from the more populated areas, they encounter a soldier who has been told to make sure nobody leaves the area to prevent whatever is going on from spreading. The soldier argues with the superior for a moment, raises his gun, and begins firing. Joel and Sarah roll down a hill to get away, but before the soldier can kill Joel, Tommy shoots him. They both look over at Sarah to see if she's okay, and notice that she's been shot.
Sarah? Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. Listen to me, I know this hurts, baby. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts. Come on, baby, please. I know, baby, I know.
She dies in Joel's arms as he does what he can to comfort her. What follows is a title sequence explaining that a parasitic fungus has mutated to infect humans, causing them to become brainless and violent. The game picks up 20 years after the death of his daughter, and we're introduced to a much more grizzled and violent Joel, who's had to make some very difficult choices in the years since the outbreak. During this time, much of society has collapsed, since most of the human population was killed by those infected with the virus. We're soon introduced to Tess, Joel's partner in crime, and Marlene, a leader in a revolutionary militia group called the Fireflies, who tells them she has a very lucrative smuggling opportunity. But when they find out that they'd be smuggling a 14-year-old girl named Ellie, Joel initially argues against it, the subtext being that Ellie reminds him of Sarah. But Tess convinces him that it'll be worth the trouble. Then during the journey, they find out that the reason they're smuggling Ellie is because she's immune to the fungal virus that's caused all this destruction, and the Fireflies believe they'll be able to study her and produce a vaccine. But once they reach the Capitol building, they discover that all the Fireflies are dead, and Marlene is nowhere to be found. Tess frantically tries to come up with a plan and figure out what to do next, but Joel doesn't understand why she's taking this job so seriously. But then Tess reveals to Joel that she's been bitten. She knows there's no hope for her, but sees Ellie and what her immunity represents as a way to redeem all the terrible things she's done.
Give me your arm. This was 3 weeks. I was bitten an hour ago and it's already worse. This is fucking real, Joel.
She tells Joel to bring Ellie to his brother Tommy, who can connect them with the Fireflies. She pushes him forward and sacrifices herself so that Joel and Ellie can continue on. The rest of the game follows Joel and Ellie as they make their way west in search of the Fireflies. Because of what happened with his daughter, Joel is initially very closed off, fearing what will happen if he becomes too attached. However, Ellie is incredibly talkative and has a very charming and sarcastic personality, which causes Joel and the player to form a strong emotional bond.
Now watch your step as you're going out, because it's going to be a little...
Now, this plot could easily make a great film, book, or TV show, but what makes The Last of Us come alive in a way no other medium could is because it's an interactive story. You physically experience what's going on and decide what actions you're going to take in order to survive. And this is what makes the game so special. The way that the story is told through actually playing the game, then mixing in the environmental storytelling, is what creates such a beautifully crafted world that has a subtle but poignant story to tell. Filmmakers use age-old techniques to convey emotion through a purely visual medium. For example, is a character feeling like they've lost everything and there's no turning back? Are they being pulled in two different directions by trusted allies, each advising they make a different decision? Or how do you convey that a character longs for adventure, but is stuck living a mundane life? These are just a few examples of the way filmmakers tell stories solely through what you see on screen, and these methods have been perfected over the years and have become the language of visual storytelling. And as an audience, we've learned how to read these cues, whether we're aware of them or not. But even though video games are a very different medium, the idea is essentially the same. How do you convey emotion when you have a participatory audience rather than a passive one? For most games, you have sections of gameplay where you control a character and interact with the virtual world, and cinematics, which are pre-rendered animations. The cinematics are what deliver most of the plot and emotional moments of the story.
Easy, son. Just take it easy.
It's all right. They're not the bad guys. Lower the gun.
Well, the gameplay is what you actually do when playing a game.
Don't worry. I would have probably done the same thing. Where are you from?
All the way from Hartford.
And The Last of Us is no exception. But what makes this particular game special is that it delivers emotion and plot through the gameplay as well as the cinematics. A common criticism is that you could just watch all the cutscenes and not miss any of the story. But by doing that, you'd miss out on all the bonding moments between Joel and Ellie. By actually playing the game, you feel and grow with the characters.
What are the things that we can do on the joystick to make you feel the same way that these characters are going to feel when we get to this next point in the story? There's a turn in a scene that we need these characters to take, and we need you to feel it or understand that, and that means you have to play it.
So from the beginning of the game, Naughty Dog puts the player in the emotional context of the characters through the way you play. During the chaotic opening of The Last of Us, you control Sarah instead of Joel. This means that you experience the beginning of a zombie apocalypse through the eyes of an innocent young girl rather than a full-bodied, capable adult. Once the outbreak begins, you continue into the Jeep to escape the house. Sarah, as a child, is completely powerless in this situation, and so is the player. When Joel and Tommy are driving and looking for an escape route, as Sarah, you look around and see how the outbreak is affecting the world. As a kid, this is how you see things, looking out the window as your parents drive through town. The only difference is when you're looking out the window as Sarah, you're watching her world collapse. And all that is just in the first 20 minutes of the game before you're introduced to any of the main mechanics. After the prologue, where Joel wakes up 20 years later, you meet Tess and begin the first section of the game. This is where you're introduced to the core mechanics of The Last of Us: stealth, combat, crafting, and navigation. A good portion of the game consists of sneaking around and avoiding enemies. This can get frustrating, but it puts the player in the same position as the characters. As Joel, we look for the best path that avoids the largest group of enemies when planning our route of attack. There's also a mechanic in the game where you can listen carefully to what's going on around you. This allows the player to pinpoint nearby enemies and simulates a sense of spatial awareness. And we're also able to get to know the world better through stealth when we overhear benign conversations between enemies.
New head honcho. Same bullshit talk.
I don't know, now that we have enough people watching all the exits, get some more generators going, I'd like to restore one of those old projectors, watch some movies or something.
This also makes it more intense when you get caught and have to fight to survive. When you get to see and hear the mundane events of the lives of your enemies, it makes having to brutally murder them for your own survival even more of a visceral and intense experience. When characters are in extreme situations, like when Joel was separated from Ellie and trying to find out where she's being held, you see an even more brutal side of him.
Now, the girl. Is she alive?
What girl? I don't know no girl.
Here, the cinematics are used to portray a more violent and angry Joel, so that when we start playing as him, we inhabit that anger and violence. We feel what he feels. Just as frantic as the combat is the game's system of crafting. The way it works is you find resources throughout your journey, and when combined, those resources create a variety of tools, such as health kits, shivs, Molotov cocktails, and more powerful weapons. But since resources are scarce, you have to be really tactful about what you craft and when.
So if there's a particular point in the story where the characters are having a particularly difficult time surviving, then we want you as the player to be finding fewer items, farther apart, harder to survive.
Because of these scarce resources, the game and the world it takes place in force you to make life or death decisions. You can't often go in guns blazing because there's limited ammo, and if you don't have enough supplies to make offensive weapons, you have to use them very strategically. Are you going to use more resources on a Molotov cocktail, or use a brick, which is more common but less effective? However, the game isn't just crafting, stealth, and combat. There are many sequences where Joel and Ellie are traveling, and you have to find a way through the decaying and depressing world. These sequences offer some of the most character-driven mechanics in the game, which help the player and Joel connect with other characters.
Teamwork.
The most prominent way this is done is through the boost mechanic. It's used first with Tess and Joel in the beginning of the game, but it becomes a very important way to get the player to bond with those they meet along the way. Joel and the player rely on Ellie and other traveling companions in order to move forward. We can't do it alone, and as we move forward and rely on each other to do so, we begin to trust one another. While these core mechanics are important and used throughout the game, they're also changed and manipulated by the developers depending on what the story needs. Those who have played the prequel story Left Behind will know of the sequence where the core mechanics of the game are changed from brutal survival to two young kids having fun in a mall. During this sequence, Ellie and her best friend Riley sneak out of the safe quarantine zone and into an abandoned mall. Throughout the additional story, we use the same tools from the main game, such as shooting and stealth, to play an intense game of hide and seek with water guns.
Alright, that's game.
Alright, best 2 out of 3.
We also see an alteration to the boost mechanic later in the game, after Ellie goes through an incredibly traumatic experience. During the bus depot section, Ellie is uncharacteristically quiet, and Joel, sensing something is wrong, tries to bring her back to her cheery self. This tension escalates and culminates when you try to boost Ellie up onto a ledge to move forward, but Ellie doesn't respond. The familiar mechanic that we've used countless times before is broken.
Ellie?
Because Ellie is broken. Things aren't the same anymore.
Ellie?
What?
The ladder. Come on.
Right.
You could have done a cutscene to show, hey, you're being very distant, and she's not responding, but to also do that in gameplay, to where it's something that you've done just countless times throughout the game with, you know, let me boost you up here, get the ladder, bring it down so we can do this systemic thing. It's a subtle choice.
Like Bruce and I talked in the beginning, is like we have these mechanics, how can we exploit them in a narrative sense? And that's one of those opportunities.
I just think it's incredible that that happens in-game. It's not a cinematic, you know, it's something that adds weight to that controller when they're playing.
One other way that The Last of Us uses a shift in mechanics is the way the game incorporates a boss battle. The term boss battle refers to a common game mechanic where you get to the end of the level and are faced with a unique and exceptionally challenging enemy. In The Last of Us, the only boss battle is when Ellie confronts David toward the end of the game. This follows a sequence where Joel is severely wounded, causing the point of view to shift and giving the player control of Ellie for the first time. You first meet David after hunting a deer, and while Ellie distrusts him initially, you quickly begin to rely on each other. Again, using the same bonding mechanics that bring you close to other characters in the game, David helps boost you up and fights with you against Infected. Both are things you've done before with trustworthy characters. But this doesn't last for long because Ellie later learns that David is the leader of a violent group of isolated survivors, who've had such bad luck gathering food that they've had to take drastic measures. After Ellie learns of their cannibalism, she ends up trapped in an old dining hall, while David tries to find and kill her. By having this be the sole boss battle in the game, Naughty Dog emphasized the importance of this event, and it helps us better understand some of Ellie's choices later in the game. It also allows us to see Ellie in a very different way. We've never seen her as ruthless as she is during this sequence, and once her ordeal is over, it's clear that she's changed. We also don't just passively watch this shift occur, but by playing as Ellie, we can feel the change in her character. After Ellie's ordeal with David, the game picks up as she and Joel continue west to find the Fireflies. As they move forward, we see more of the beautiful world that Naughty Dog has created. Every environment in the game has so much life and character, with every building or street telling its own story.
Mandatory evacuation. Evacuate to where?
What do you think? Quarantine zone. See, some places got a heads up before the infection showed up. Most didn't.
Man, must be hard. Just leaving all your stuff behind like that.
That ain't the hard part.
This attention to detail is part of what makes the game so beautiful, and this beauty, whether natural, man-made, or both, is also contrasted with the brutal and disgusting nature of what it takes to survive. You come across gorgeous vistas and abandoned homes that are imbued with so much character and personality, but just moments later you're fighting for your life and fending off unspeakable horrors. This duality between the beauty of nature and the harsh reality of survival is personified in the Infected. They're people who were once just like you and me, but are now violent and terrifying because of the natural fungus inhabiting their mind. But just like the colorful fungus we see in nature, they're rather beautiful, despite their unintentional violence.
Really like that conscious of something so horrific that it's gonna like stop at nothing, its relentless force of death, and yet elements of it are beautiful. It's not just about gore. It's not just about everything about it being scary, because to us it's actually scarier when things on it are somewhat benign or somewhat beautiful.
And just like the long-forgotten buildings, nature has taken us over, and the result is both beautiful and tragic. While being gorgeous to look at, the environment also serves the very important role of guiding the player through the narrative, and making the world feel more alive. From the beginning of the game when you play as Sarah, visual cues are used to guide you to where the story needs you to go. For example, when walking down the hallway, you see an intense flickering light. This immediately draws your curiosity, and you're rewarded with a memorable and intense story moment. Then throughout the entire opening sequence, since the core mechanics haven't been introduced yet, the environment adapts to push the player where they need to go. When these techniques are done right, they guide the player through a level without them ever realizing they're being directed. But beyond just the utility of creating fun and exciting environments for the player to explore, Naughty Dog also maintain a strong sense of reality. The AI, for example, is incredibly complex and makes the non-playable characters, or NPCs, seem incredibly real. This AI is what makes characters like Ellie and your other companions move and interact with the world. As you're walking around, you'll see Ellie get distracted or make comments on what's around her.
Hey, look! Gnomes.
Yeah, those are gnomes.
Man, I had an art book filled with these.
These can be scripted moments where the developers have programmed Ellie to say a certain line or do something at a specific time. Sometimes when things have been really intense, she'll pull out a pun book to lighten the mood.
I tried to catch some fog earlier. I missed.
Even though this is a scripted moment that the developers have written into the game, it feels like something that Ellie would naturally do. But there are also organic moments that just happen as a result of the complex AI. Since the NPCs are programmed to do certain things in certain situations, the game is filled with random moments that would be impossible to recreate. So having both the scripted moments that seem incredibly real, and the organic, non-scripted moments, which are random and only you experience, really help the characters come alive. It also helps the player form an emotional bond with the other characters, because they seem like real people who take action of their own volition. You'll also see the emotional state of some of the characters reflected in their animations. When hiding from enemies, Ellie will often run to Joel, who provides cover.
We have certain animations that play in the beginning of the game on Ellie. She's traveling with Joel, who she doesn't really know. There's a lot of gestures to make her look nervous, just her overall stance. Later on in the game, they develop a relationship through the animation, not just the dialogue. You can see that she's more comfortable around him. If that reads well with the player, then, you know, we're doing our job.
But the environmental design isn't just about getting the characters to interact with the world and guiding the player through the narrative. In our world and in The Last of Us, every environment has a story. In the game, there's a specific sequence that, while still guiding the player, tells an incredibly powerful story. The Tale of Ish is without a doubt environmental storytelling at its finest. It takes place during a section of the game when Joel and Ellie are traveling with a man named Henry and his younger brother Sam. In order to avoid some nearby infected, the group goes into a sewer, and as you explore, you discover that in the early years of the outbreak, it used to be the home of a somewhat thriving community. Through a series of notes, most of which are left by a man named Ish, you learn the history of this community and how he created a safe haven in a nearby sewer system. Then when Ish began venturing outside, he met some people who surprisingly didn't want to kill him. Because they had children to protect, he decided to invite them into his new home. With the help of a few others, they formed a tight-knit and, more importantly, somewhat secure community. However, when somebody forgot to close a door, the infected got in, and those who weren't killed were trapped. This story isn't told through dialogue or visuals, but through finding and reading notes left by those who came before. And what elevates this story, and what makes it more engaging and emotional than something else you might read, is you discover this story as you play. If you don't care about exploring, you could easily miss these notes. But once you find the first one, it becomes almost an obsession to look for more, and find out what happened to Ish and his family. But it's not just the notes that tell the story of what happened, it's the environment itself as you're exploring their home in the sewers. This means that you see the rain catchers mentioned and the playroom they built for the kids. It also means that when you come across the room the children were trapped in, you see and feel the choice made by the adult protecting them.
Jesus.
It should be noted that just about all the game mechanics and storytelling techniques discussed aren't unique to The Last of Us. There are many games that tell incredible stories that are felt through gameplay, and worlds that are real and tell their own stories. But what makes The Last of Us special is that it takes all these techniques and theories about game design and applies them in a very specific way to tell a very specific story. The Last of Us didn't produce groundbreaking technology or fundamentally change the video game industry, but what it did do is use and perfect techniques to bring to life a story that Naughty Dog wanted to tell. While the game is left on somewhat of an ambiguous note, it'll be incredibly fascinating to see where the franchise is taken. There's a film adaptation in the works, but after watching a 20-minute video explaining how the story can only exist as a game, it should surprise nobody that the film's development is currently at a standstill. Besides, we've already seen an adequate adaptation. The other and more interesting development is the announcement of The Last of Us Part 2, which will focus on Ellie, who is now a bit older. While many fans are nervous about a sequel that doesn't live up to the expectations left by the original, Neil Druckmann has assured fans that Naughty Dog is just as nervous, and they wouldn't be telling this story if they didn't feel like it needed to be told. But regardless of how the sequel turns out, The Last of Us has certainly stood the test of time, in part due to its execution, but also because of the relationship between Joel and Ellie and the journey they go on. It's a universal story about growing up and caring for somebody else. So even though it may be a game, for those of us who've played it, The Last of Us is an experience we'll never forget, and it'll stay with us for many years to come.